Now that we have all of our authentication and protections around our API route set up, there's one last thing we need to do in the form of authorization. We want to make sure only the appropriate users can update and delete certain records, meaning you can only update and delete records that you already own as a user. If you're interested in following along with the entire series, make sure to check out part 1. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and get started. Now, we are validating that a user is logged in when they try to update a record, but what we really want to make sure is that a user cannot update a record that they do not own. This is something that a lot of people miss and is our final step in our authentication, authorization more specifically here, of deciding the user is logged in, but what access do they have? And they shouldn't have access to remove or update records that they didn't create themselves. So we want to add that logic. And I want to show just how this is going to work. So let me log out. I've got Twitter set up. So I'm going to log back in with my Twitter account. So we'll log back in with Twitter here. And we should see that I have no records when we come back, because again, there's no records in Airtable that are associated with my Twitter user. And then I will create a new record, new from Twitter user. And then I should be able to see this, and I can update this appropriately, assuming those things are still working. And it looks like they are, so I can toggle this on and off. So that seems to be working well, but I want to add this extra piece inside of our update and our delete to make sure that users cannot update or delete records that they don't own. So what we're going to do is we're going to create some middleware, and middleware is basically what this is. This require authentication is middleware in the sense that we can just use it to wrap this function. It will do some logic, and then it will call this function if the logic passes. If not, it will go ahead and return itself. So we're going to kind of define that ourselves. So inside of our API directory, let's create a new folder, and this will be our middleware folder. And this is only going to have one file on it, but it's a good idea of getting in the habit of doing this, separating things into their own folders. So this is going to be an own record file. And we're going to need a reference to our Auth0, so we'll import that from, go back one directory into utils and Auth0. And then we will also import our Airtable table from the Airtable file that we created. And then we're going to create this function. So const owns record equals, this thing is going to accept a handler, and then it's going to return an async function that takes in that request response and then does some sort of logic. And at the end of this, we want to export default owns record. So we're just going to export this function. Now notice that this part looks exactly like our API endpoints do. So it's an async and then a request and response. And again, our middleware is going to have the same format here. We're going to be able to wrap this whole thing now with our owns record function. Actually, we'll do this slightly different. We'll wrap everything in require authentication, and then in the middle of that or inside of that, we'll wrap this handler with our owns record. So it'll check for authentication, and then it'll make sure that the user actually owns the record that is being attempted to be worked on. So what we want to do is first grab the user from our session. So what should happen at this point is we will know that the user is logged in. And so we'll go ahead and destructure the user from our session. So await auth0, get the session there and pass in that request. All right. And then we also want to grab the ID from the request.body. So from the body, we want to destructure the ID property, rec.body. And this is going to be the ID of the record that the user is trying to update or delete, the one that we want to make sure that the user owns. So what we need to do is go into Airtable, find the record, the existing record that's in the database, and then check its user ID and compare it to the sub of the logged in user. Hopefully that makes sense. So I'm going to stub out a try catch here. So there's a little snippet. And inside of this try catch, we need to first get the existing record. So we'll await and then table.find, and we'll pass in this ID. So that's how we find a specific record in Airtable. And if there is no existing record, or if the sub property of the user does not equal the existing record.fields.user ID. So if there is no existing record, or if there is an existing record, but the user that is trying to work with this record does not own that record, we want to return back an error. So we would set a status code, res.statuscode equals 404, and then we will return a res.json, and then we'll just send back a message of record not found. Now we're saying record not found here just to kind of give some ambiguity to make sure that the user doesn't know if they're trying to do some penetration testing or something, or if they're trying to actually like learn things about the records in there. We're not being too specific. We don't want to tell them too many details. So in this case, we're just saying the record was not found. So then we will attach the rec.record, or we'll attach this existing record as a record property here on the request. This request will then be passed on to the handler that is right here. So there's our handler. All right, and then what we're going to do at the end of this is call the handler and do request response, pass that in. So we are inside of this middleware. We're grabbing the user from the session. We're grabbing the ID from the body, and then we're finding, based on that ID, the existing record in our Airtable database. And then if the sub property, or if the user ID property of that existing record does not match the sub property of the logged in user, we're returning back a 404 and saying record not found. All right, and if there's an error in this case, we will log out our error, and then we'll say res.statuscode equals 500, and then we'll send back a res.json as well. So res.json, and we'll say message, something went wrong. All right, and I was planning on kind of double wrapping this with the require authentication, but what we can do is go ahead and do that right here. So auth0.require authentication, and we'll just wrap this entire function with that there. All right, so there is our owns record middleware. And now inside of update to do, we want to import owns record from our middleware / owns record. All right, so we'll import that thing. And instead of wrapping this with auth0.require authentication, we will wrap this with owns record. Now, the reason we can do that is because we've already wrapped owns record with require authentication. And then we'll do the same thing inside of our delete. So we'll import this here, and then instead of auth0.require authentication, we will call this, wrap this with owns record. And the rest of that stuff should stay the same. So let's add another item here, a new item, and click submit. We should have that get in here. We should be able to update this. And it looks like we're actually getting a 500 here. So let's go and double check to see if we have an issue in our code. And I think we made one mistake here where this auth0 require authentication, this needs to actually wrap this function in here. So it's going to take in the handler, and then we're going to wrap this async function. All right, so we'll give that a shot. Let's go ahead and refresh our page. And now let's try to update this thing. And it looks like that worked. And now we'll just check to see inside of Airtable, just make sure that that thing is checked. And you can see that we've got 2 records for the Twitter user, 1 for the auth0 user, and everything seems to be working okay. I should be able to delete records as well. That seems to work. And then I can add a new record and update this one, update that one. I can log out. And the one thing we might want to do is just add a piece of context when we're logged out. So if in the index page, if we are logged out, might have a little bit of a message to say, hey, you should log in to save to do. So let's say if there is not a user, and then we'll add a little p tag here and say, you should log in to save your to-dos. So let's just save that. Just want to see this little bit of text here. That's great. We'll do a login. We will sign in with Twitter again, and this whole process should work the same way it had before. And we should see all of our data and be able to update our CRUD, update our to-dos with those CRUD operations. All right, that's going to wrap up the development of this application, but stick around for the next video where we'll talk about a wrap up of what we accomplished and then maybe what some next steps are for you in your learning process with Next.js, Airtable, Tailwind, and Auth0.